Let's Talk Day is an annual opportunity to start conversations about mental health, and organizations and individuals across the country join the cause every year. In honor of this initiative, national team member David James Smith has taken a big step towards ending the negative stigma surrounding mental illness by having a courageous conversation about his personal struggles with anxiety and depression. This interview contains sensitive content that some may find difficult to hear, but David James is not alone in his struggle with mental illness. According to the Canadian Mental Health Association, about 1 in 5 Canadians will personally experience mental health concerns or illness. That's around 6.7 million of us. This means that, although difficult, this is an essential conversation. Do you want to share with me why you decided to actually come forward with this idea and share these challenges you've been facing?
Yeah. Okay, Casey. Well, first, I want to thank Bulls Canada for totally being on board with this. I know it's a subject matter that I personally feel is really important. Subject to mental illness, and I know that we have, thank God, a day at least dedicated with Bell Let's Talk to give us an opportunity to have that conversation. And basically, I wanted to come forward with a way that maybe I can contribute to that conversation, with hopes that maybe it can reach people in terms of maybe better understanding it, or even more importantly, those that are maybe suffering from it and don't know what to do or are too afraid to come forward with it. I'm hoping that my story that I can share can help encourage and inspire some to do the same.
That's great. Do you want to start off by sharing what you've been going through and some of the challenges you've had to face?
Yeah, definitely. Basically, it's for me personally, it's been an ongoing thing. Anxiety and depression for me have been an ongoing struggle, if you will, a reality. Whether I wasn't aware of it in the beginning or became aware of it and didn't know what to do, I've struggled with anxiety and depression my whole life. Uh, I think I can probably go back to the, you know, 6, 7 years old, understanding what it is now. Just growing up, a lot of bullying at home. Bullying at school was really bad. Being the youngest, smallest, a bald spot on my head when I was young before surgeries. Kids are just relentless. And, whether it was the beats, whether it was teasing, even one time, I remember getting pushed downstairs at school and they thought it was funny. That reality was just, that would create anxiety as a child. You'd be nervous to go to school and have to face these things. And then go home and have to deal with the realities of, unfortunately, an abusive households, alcoholism, and also a lot of bullying, which made it really hard because as a kid, you need a safe place. And unfortunately, never really had that. So as a result, that anxiety really became a constant state. It could affect school. It could affect social behavior, really having trouble integrating with other kids. Um, and I remember after a few years of this, I had a really hard time with it as a kid. I felt pretty alone, especially you're going back to, at this point, let's say 9 years old. So you're talking like late 80s, 1990. These discussions weren't being had yet. And bullying wasn't even a main thing. That's, thank God, has become a discussion that we've been having over the last decade. But at that time, it wasn't as common. Um, and I remember at 9 years old being overly consumed by these things. And um, the the reality of between home and school became a little much, or very much so. And I remember at 9 years old um, being so, feeling so trapped, so scared, if you will, just due to that anxiety where you're not sleeping at night. You're constantly in a state of fear, fear of what could happen. also depression kicking in, not really seeing any positives ahead, not feeling joy as much. Um, I remember um, 9 years old. When I look back, it blew my mind. But at 9 years old, I remember was the first time that I actually thought of suicide. Um, I remember specifically it was with a pillowcase and over my head. And then next thing you know, I was frustrated because I could breathe through the pillowcase. And that's when I took it up a notch with a grocery bag and tried um, multiple times. And I guess the human spirit's stronger than anything. And the will to survive subconsciously at that time, thank God, prevented me from doing it. But I never spoke to anybody about it. No one at home knew. No one at school knew. Certainly didn't know what was going on at home. And so I stayed with this pain and this anxiety for years. The bullying continued till I was about 12 or 13 at school. Thank God that that eased up. That at least gave me a chance to feel like I could integrate and make friends at school a little easier, which I'm grateful for. Some of those friends I have to this day. Um, and then growing up, by the age of 16, the anger based on all that had started kicking in, and the household just became completely unmanageable to live in. And I was homeless at 16. So for a year, I couch surfed. Um, I luckily had a couple friends that really put themselves out there with their families and put me up for a few months each. Gave me a sense of at least stability. But my school grades were really, really suffering. I wasn't sleeping at night anymore. I was just consumed with depression at that point. That was really a lot of depression. And then self-destructive behavior kicked in. And one thing I've come to understand now, I remember back then with my anger and my depression, I would get into fights and I would be very combative. But depression makes you feel really numb, and it makes it hard to feel and relate to anybody. And I remember at that time I would hit things just to feel something, and the pain would let me know that I was alive. And somebody close to me that I know dealt with something similar to this, but it was cutting. It was self-mutilation. And it turns out, as I came to understand it, it was very similar to the same reasons why I would hit things. And as depression kicked in over time, it led me into other self-destructive behaviors as a teen and into my early adulthood. I was looking at, I was, drinking. For me, it wasn't drinking daily, but it was as a self-medicating thing. It was more drinking to escape. So I would be the guy that would excessively drink to the point where he was sick and blacked out. And at that age, people kind of laugh about it and whatever, but looking back, all it was just really me trying to escape. It was, if I couldn't take my life, I just hoped I wouldn't wake up from blacking out. And that behavior persisted for years. It was just me trying to find a way out. I couldn't handle it anymore. Unfortunately, due to some of the beliefs out there about depression, depression is weakness. I didn't want to accept that I was depressed. I was too proud to get help. I was afraid that they would just label me as something, let alone taking medication. Medication was like the ultimate towel in the ring. I'm a loser. I'm too weak to handle this on my own. All that toxic masculinity as well was really kicking in. So I went from alcohol to all of a sudden when I was in college, and as many of us were studying like crazy and we're active. I was working, training. I was playing sports. I discovered amphetamines and caffeine. I didn't drink coffee, but all of a sudden I found a solution to my depression in a pill. And what that would do is that would give me the high that I needed in order to feel well. But it was exactly that. It was not a temporary thing or an occasional thing. It became a habitual thing. And I actually had a doctor explain to me that the high from those caffeine pills that I was taking was very similar to cocaine in terms of what it was doing to my brain. So for a year, I was taking that. And what I noticed is that as I would come down from it, I could just take another pill. And all of a sudden, I was remaining completely high on this stuff, but it was really ramping up my anxiety. So I was getting away from depression, but all of a sudden going back to anxiety again. And the day came when I was training in the gym. From the time I started taking those pills to then, I was taking 4 times the amount. And like many addictions, to keep the high going, you always have to take more, and that leads often to severe consequences. For me, I ended up having an aneurysm in the gym, and being too young and foolish, I didn't go see a doctor. But a doctor later on told me that's what it seemed as if I had had, and it was enough to get me to stop taking the pills, but not enough for me to recognize that I had an issue in the first place. So that kind of behavior continued until basically I found out I was going to be a dad. And that was one of the big blessings of my life, is it really got me to clean up. Um, so I wanted to be the best parent I could, which was great. But I was still failing to recognize the depression and the anxiety. And that continued for the next 10 years, until my separation at 30. And the only addiction I really had during that time was just caffeine, once again, but not in pill form. I was taking, I think I remember at the peak, it was 7 extra large Timmy's coffees a day. Like, it was obscene. Once again, not sleeping, not taking care of my body, keeping that anxiety up. So when I got separated and that life altering event happened, um, I had failed to recognize how I could have contributed to my own sort of demise, if you will. And unfortunately, to go through that period of time, what followed afterwards, I still wasn't getting help because I was too proud again. And I remember going through some, as divorces and all that are really difficult for many, and it's unfortunately a very common reality. Um, the custody stuff and all that kicked in, and I remember depression was bad, and I remember my anxiety got really high as soon as we went that direction. And I remember specifically, to give an idea how it affects us, the depression kicked in where I just completely disconnected from people. I had friendships that suffered because all of a sudden I just dropped off the face of the earth. I wouldn't answer texts. I wouldn't pick up calls. Community organizations that I was with, I wasn't involved anymore with, just disappeared. Relationships, all of a sudden just walked away from with seemingly no real reason. And the anxiety for me had really ramped up. And I remember one example that stands out to me to this day was I had a friend come over, knocking at the door, and there was a window on my front door, the curtain, and I could see their silhouette there. And all I was just curled up in a ball next to the door, but I couldn't say anything, and I was just crying. Um, I was I was just consumed with this inability to speak and this inability to want to see anybody, and especially let people see me in that state. So I kind of cut off from the world. And what was difficult at this time, I was in bowls. I was club president for a couple of years already by that point. I was even federation president, and this anxiety just ramped up to the point where all of a sudden I was canceling meetings at the last minute, or I was calling in sick, which is common for anxiety and depression. Thank God my VP was great. He always picked it up, but no one knew. They just figured I was being irresponsible or that I didn't care, but no one knew that it's because I couldn't even leave the house. Um, so that continued for quite some time. Um, And then in the last 10 years, it would come and go, come and go. And when there was more legal issues with custody again kicked in, that took me to the final place in terms of depression and anxiety. Um, it affected my life to a point where I couldn't work um, anymore. I was always calling in sick, or I was super um, non-productive at work. I had responsibilities at work that I just wasn't meeting anymore. And I remember it was specifically around the time of the North America Challenge, actually, the last time we had gone down. And I was dealing with an immense amount of anxiety. Once again, no one really knew. Might have been evident, but I was too proud to talk about it. And I remember coming home shortly after that time, and I couldn't take it anymore. That My girlfriend at the time was gone for the weekend, and I got to the point where I felt like I was worthless as a father. Um, the depression had created such a dark cloud over my head that I felt, as a father, as a friend, as a partner, as a teammate in bowls, I had let everyone down, and that I wasn't worthy of anything. I felt like I was living a lie, and that's when I planned to take my life. Um, the girlfriend was gone for the weekend. I wasn't answering her messages, and for me, it was simple. I just looked at the garage, I duct tape a hose in my car, and that was it. I could have gone to sleep one last time. And the next day, when she came home, I had to confess as to what was up. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. And I'm grateful for that, because it was that moment where I reached out for help, and with truly, I had surrendered to the fact that my life was just unmanageable, and I needed help. And I think that's when I finally put my pride aside, because I realized that my willingness to want to have a better life was stronger than my pride. And yeah, that was the beginning of the recovery, if you will. So for the last 2.5 years, that's been a mainstay for me, and probably will.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's really difficult what you went through. What were the steps you took to get help?
Well, first of all, reaching out to see a therapist. And I'm grateful, because this therapist is still the same therapist to this day. Somebody I see very regularly, at times even weekly. Things are really tense. But it's been 2.5 years, and between therapy and talking with her, starting medication as well, she helped me understand that the medication was really just to help bridge chemically what's happening in the brain. Basically, prolonged anxiety and depression created deficiencies in terms of the feel good hormones in the brain. And as a result, my brain got to a point where it didn't recognize if it was in a state of threat or not, that it just always stayed ramped up. And so through the medication helped sort of fill the gaps in terms of the chemical side, and then working with her, she really helped. I found that therapy for me helped first identify the issues, so really better understand how anxiety and depression were making my life unmanageable, understanding how maybe some elements of my environment were toxic or maybe contributing to those, so making changes to those, recognizing how they were affecting me, not only when they were really on set, but also maybe ramping up, coming on, recognizing it and giving me some tools or some techniques to better manage them early on. And those were really empowering. Like, for the first time in my life, I felt like I was starting to feel empowered over these things that had just crippled me for decades. And so through just consistently working on it, and understanding that some days are going to be better than others. Some days are just write-offs, but they end and you wake up the next day and you hope to, you know, maybe make progress from there. And it's been really good. It's been liberating to be able to have that kind of connection with somebody that can help me, not judge me, but just understand maybe my blind spots that I'm not seeing in those moments.
Hmm.
And yeah, to finally feel like I can take control of my life again.
Hmm. That's great. So you mentioned the societal stigmas a little bit, like the toxic masculinity and not wanting to seem
Hmm.
weak. Do those affect you now still at all, or not
Um,
anymore?
no, I can't say they affect me the same way because obviously I've stepped forward and I'm willing to do this.
For sure.
Now, if you would have asked me to do this 3 years ago, there wasn't a chance I would have ever done this.
Hmm.
What I do see is, and obviously both genders deal with really unfair societal stigmas and expectations. As a man, I know that we're taught early or shown, or somehow it just kind of becomes a way of thought that we're not supposed to speak of our feelings, let alone depression and anxiety. Um, so that's a big hurdle for a lot of men or boys, teenagers and men growing up, is just the ability to acknowledge that we're allowed to speak of our emotions, let alone the ability to step up and say, you know what, I can use some help. Um, Being able to understand that maybe anxiety and depression doesn't need to go to the point where it's your life's become unmanageable, like in my kid's situation. But if we look at the last year with COVID, I mean, that's a reality that everybody's living with. And either it could be depression from the isolation, people being cut off from their loved ones, let's say through the holidays, or not being able to see loved ones in general. Maybe those weekend visits that we did, we can't do them anymore. For my case, my daughter's in another part, like in another part of the province. She's a little out of town, and they're right now, we're in full lockdown. I can't even go see her without that being an issue. And that's my own child.
Hmm.
So isolation wreaks havoc on the mind, and a lot of people, that isolation can bring out depression, which is understandable. The fact that we can't do anything, right? So many things have been taken away in terms of pastimes, outlets like the gyms, things like that for a lot of people. So, um, being able to openly talk about these things right now, I think with COVID, and the anxieties, with the uncertainties of everything, people's employment, health, fear that, could I catch it? Could I get sick? My loved ones, could they get sick? I think it's really important that those stigmas that normally oppress the idea that depression is weak, anxiety, just get a grip. That's a common one. Um, you know, uh, People need to start getting more informed as to maybe what are the signs of these things so we can start recognizing them not only in ourselves, but maybe in our loved ones that are too afraid to speak up.
Hmm. So since getting help, how have your like relationships and involvement in bowls and things like that improved for you?
Well, first of all, I find that everything, there's been a lot more stability in everything. Like, give you another idea, depression, anxiety, wreaking havoc. I couldn't stand, like, I was afraid of stability. With my growing up, I was afraid that, things could happen, things could come up, and you're constantly changing because there's no stability in here. It almost as if it had to demonstrate itself in my environment. So I moved, I think in my lifetime, I've lived in 30 plus different homes. Um, Obviously, not the ideal. And I'm happy to say that I've been in this place for 3 years now. And part of that is just understanding that there's value in stability.
Hmm.
And, tomorrow is going to be okay. And I've started, removed myself from a very toxic work environment where I was working prior. That was one lifestyle change that I did for myself. Started working for myself for the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, and that's been going very well. So as a result, that not only got me out of a toxic environment, but it also put me in a position to feel better about myself, my abilities. Obviously your self-esteem when you can succeed. And with regards to bowls, obviously this past season was a write-off with COVID, but I think for bowls as well, it allowed me to better manage my stress on the green. Often I will skip teams so it can make me a better leader and better teammate to them. Um, in singles for bowls, let's say where you don't have that, the big one is the anxiety, performance anxiety, and all that. Getting a grip on that. And the one mantra that my uncle shared with me many years ago seems to apply not only to bowls but to life now. It's one bowl at a time, one end at a time, one game at a time. And life is kind of like that. Like, don't worry about the next end. Just focus on what's in your hand right now. You got a bowl in singles, you still got a shot. And I've kind of taken that mantra into life for myself, and it's allowed me to stay more present as opposed to in the pain of the past or the fear of the future. It's all about just being in the moment, being today.
Right.
And it's helped. I mean, I'm not saying that every day is great, but definitely way more good days than bad now. And it's allowed me to feel way more empowered and able to maybe want to plan more plans in the future because I'm not afraid of the future and I'm not stuck in the pain anymore.
Mm-hmm. That's great to hear. So, how would you suggest someone could support a loved one who is dealing with mental illness?
That's a really good question because I think it's important to say that, as much as for those that it's maybe evident or they've come forward and said that, they're suffering. I think that for the loved ones, they need to understand that just being present, let it be known that you can be present can help. Um, Maybe getting better informed yourselves. I find that that's a big one, is that for people that have loved ones that are suffering from depression, anxiety, or other forms of mental illness, do your homework, understand what it is, because sometimes the person suffering doesn't quite understand everything about it. So by doing a bit of homework and understanding, like depression can, it could affect people's workplaces. It's not that they're lazy, it's they're dealing with depression. So that could be absences of work, that could be low productivity, that could be just general lethargic behavior. Um, Anxiety, it could be compulsive behaviors, it could be a fearful behavior, it could be very nervous tensions, things like this. These are all little flags that we can pick up over time. Another one for anxiety is forgetfulness. The brain's running so fast that often people can forget. Well, sometimes it's important to understand that none of this stuff is personal. It's just this person's struggling. They don't understand how. And as a loved one, we let them know that you're there, get informed, and try to have this discussion with them if they're open to it. And if they choose to maybe think about getting help, or maybe if you can encourage them to get help and create a support unit for somebody who needs to get help, that can go a long way. Because as somebody who has suffered and is still trying to manage these things, it's really easy for us to feel alone. And if we can understand that you've got that support system around, as much as we may not openly say thank you, it does help us know that we're not alone. And for the loved ones, it can be very difficult. Sometimes it's not about being there for the person that's suffering from mental illness, but also I would say that there are support groups for people that are affected by mental illness in the family. It's also important not to forget that. Sometimes it's not just about the support for the person suffering from the illness, but it's also support groups for the people that are greatly affected by those suffering from it. And there's a lot of resources out there. So I would encourage people to sort of do their homework on that.
For sure. Is there anything else you'd like to share or any other advice you'd like to provide?
Um, well, the message in general, I think, is really just to, you know, I hope that this talk at least can help people maybe understand that the stigmas of mental illness, they're not weak, or they're not quitters, or they're not inadequate. They're not, if it comes to even things as severe as suicide, like, I think it's important that people understand that mental illness is just as much an illness as, let's say, some of the other movements we've been seeing, like ALS, MS, cancer. It's an illness of the brain. And unfortunately, the illness of the brain is what computes everything that goes on in our life. It affects how we see the things around in our lives. And for people to sort of maybe temper their judgments on that, to get informed and to develop more compassion and understanding towards those that are suffering, because the numbers are astronomical. And I think in this year, with regards to what this pandemic has really done to society, I think if there's a time to have this discussion about mental illness, now is more important than ever, because I think more people are suffering from it than they realize. And already we feel physically isolated. I think the last thing we need to do is feel emotionally and psychologically isolated as well. I think it's important to reach out, to have this conversation, to discuss it. So anyone who's already isolated at home with this, they don't feel like they're alone suffering. I think it's important that we understand that we're all in this together. And I'm hoping that this discussion, at least today, can help contribute to that movement, and that we can maybe continue this discussion further on.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for being so open, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat about this stuff. It's
No
definitely going to
problem,
make an
Casey.
impact. Everyone has their own story and their own experiences with mental health, and we are very appreciative of David James for sharing his. We are also grateful that Bell Let's Talk Day gives us a chance to build awareness and break the stigma, since 1 in 5 people will personally experience mental illness in their lifetime. If you are suffering and you're not sure who to turn to or where to go find help, you can refer to this list of helpful resources on the letstalk.bell.ca website, and the Canadian Sport Helpline is a safe place for victims and witnesses of harassment, abuse, and discrimination, which includes bullying, to report their concerns. The theme for this year's Bell Let's Talk campaign is Be There, and as an organization, we are continuing to become educated and increase the ways we can support our athletes and the entire Bulls community. We encourage you to keep the conversation going and educate yourself so you can be there for others around you who are struggling and support yourself and your loved ones as best you can.